Concerns have gotten so bad that Trump agreed to be screened.
Time and hasn't bothered to do the work. That's one reason.
Is Trump mentally unfit to be president? That is an awkward question, but it's one that's being asked on every major news network in America.
President Trump's fitness for office is now the top story in the country.
Reports suggest that even Trump's advisors are worried about it.
Everyone around the president questions his intelligence and fitness for office.
100% of the people around him.
Concerns have gotten so bad that Trump agreed to be screened for dementia as part of his last health exam. None of this has to do with Trump's political positions. They have to do with his ability to understand the world around him and make good decisions.
Everybody wants to know, is this president of sound mind?
And if talking about this kind of thing makes you uncomfortable, wait till you see how much it's stressing out actual mental health experts.
In a series of tweets, the president insisted that he is like really smart and a very stable genius.
Last October, a group of 27 mental health experts published this book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. In it, they warned that Trump's behavior shows him to be dangerously unstable, describing him as a pathological narcissist who's delusional, suffers from paranoid ideation, lacks conscience and empathy, and exhibits a host of destructive and dangerous psychiatric symptoms. Yeah, it's rough. 2 months after its publishing, the book's editor met with 12 US senators to talk about Trump's mental fitness. That editor's name?
It's Dr. Bandy Lee. I am a forensic psychiatrist at Yale School of Medicine and an internationally recognized expert on violence.
Since the book came out, Dr. Lee has become kind of the face of mental health experts warning about Trump.
We express our consensus view that Mr. Trump is a danger to national and international security. Some of the psychological signs are impulsivity, recklessness, paranoid reactions, having a loose grip on reality, lacking empathy, having rage reactions. All of these are highly associated with violence.
This week's chaos in the Trump administration is by now unsurprising and was, in effect, predicted by the new book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president, edited by Bandy Lee, MD, a psychiatrist. The book includes and validates some of the general news media's speculation about Donald Trump's mental capacity. Henry Friedman, associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, on the role of Donald Trump's cabinet relevant to this week's Tillerson story. He says, a paranoid, hypersensitive, grandiose, ill-informed leader such as Donald Trump, who has surrounded himself with a cabinet and set of advisors who either are unable to bring him out of his paranoid suspicions and insistencies, or worse, identify with his positions, represents a multi-dimensional threat to our country and the world. And Dr. Lee, when a psychiatrist sees this that way, that's the definition of the duty to warn.
Exactly. When silence contributes to harm to the public health, then we do have a duty to speak out. After the conference, hundreds of mental health professionals got in touch with me, expressing their same concern.
This is an historic work in the history of American psychiatry. We have never been in this place before. Thank you both very much.
Dr. Bandy Lee is an internationally recognized expert on violence. She organized the Duty to Warn conference and edited the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. Lay out what your concerns are as a psychiatrist.
There is very little inhibition in place right now. Within 5 minutes of the commander-in-chief's orders, nuclear missiles could be launched without question. And
how does that relate to his mental fitness?
And of course, his decision-making capacity, having such levels of impulsivity, having a loose grip on reality, and being so fragile in his ability to cope with ordinary stresses, such as basic criticisms or unflattering news.
A bill on Capitol Hill that could start a formal process to evaluate any president's mental fitness is getting more interest, with 56 co-sponsors, all Democrats. The Democrat who introduced the bill joins me now, Congressman Jamie Raskin of Maryland. Congressman, thanks so much for being here. You and several of your Democratic House colleagues met with a psychiatry professor from Yale, Dr. Bandy Lee. She told CNN today, quote, as the president is unraveling, he seems to be losing his grip on reality and reverting to conspiracy theories. There are signs that he is going into attack mode when he is under stress. That means he has the potential to become impulsive and very volatile, unquote. Did she say that to the assembled congresspeople?
Well, I think that Dr. Lee and other psychiatrists who've been up to meet with members of Congress have been predicting increasingly delusional and paranoid behavior on the part of the president. Of course, we're not mental health professionals, we're not psychiatrists, that's not our role, but we do have a very defined and important role under the 25th Amendment to the Constitution, which is to set up a body that could act with the vice president in the event of an emergency when the president becomes unable for mental or physical reasons to successfully discharge the powers and duties of office.
Sure,
so the bill just sets up the body that would be able to go to work if there were a real crisis.
Well, that's a terrible lack of empathy. It shows, as in the most recent instance in Puerto Rico, a complete incapacity to feel what they're feeling and to protect them in the way that our government is supposed to.
Let me add one more. How about the inability to ever admit you were wrong, even if you have changed a position? What does that indicate?
Well, profound denial, a rigidity, a kind of preference for one's self-importance and delusions of one's perfection over the reality.
You know, on the radio, many of our callers ask the question or posit the notion that Donald Trump is mentally ill. You assert that that's not the right question. That's not the relevant. Why is that not the right question?
Well, there are a number of reasons. One, being mentally ill is not a disqualification for high office. Just think about Abraham Lincoln and Winston
suffered from
Churchill.
Depression.
Exactly. Great leaders. Second of all, having a mental illness isn't what we're talking about. We're talking about functional impairment, somebody who can't process information, who can't make subtle, nuanced discriminations, who can't consult other people, but who gets overwhelmed by his own personal insecurity and urgency and has to lash out impulsively and vindictively.
Are you just describing the president in those last couple of sentences?
I'm describing my experience of the president, yeah.
As an expert on violence, I can tell you that previous violence shows an indication for possible future violence, and he has already shown verbal aggressiveness, history of sexual assault, incitement to violence at his rallies, endorsement of violence in public speeches, and he's shown an attraction to violence and powerful weapons, as well as he has taunted hostile nations with nuclear power. All these things are signs of danger. It's really an unprecedented event that such a large number of mental health professionals have come forth about their concerns about any president.
The group that you're a part of, the psychiatric group, you're a contributor to a book called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. What are some of the key concerns about Trump that you and your colleagues raise?
Well, I wrote a letter together with Judith Herman to the New York Times in which we raised two issues. One was his relation to reality, which is I would say solipsistic and untenable and very dangerous to everyone.
What do you mean solipsistic?
Solipsistic from within the self. In other words, he only sees the world from within his sense of self. He can't have empathy for others. He can't really think into the future, the consequences of his actions, because he's totally preoccupied with the immediate event and how he can deal with it or manipulate it as emerging through the perception on the part of his sense of self. That's very extreme. People who are psychotic behave that way.
Nixon was a criminal president. We've never been confronted with this kind of consistent dishonesty in terms of the president projecting a public debate that is based from the beginning of his presidency through today. Look indeed what he's tried to do, the pretzel he got himself into trying to explain the Russians in Afghanistan with no understanding of the history of his own time and hasn't bothered to do the work. That's one reason that Mattis, Tillerson, and others came to the conclusion that we have a national emergency. The national emergency is not the wall, it's Donald Trump.
At times of tragedy, people look to their leaders. We've obviously looked at the president's reaction to the man sending the pipe bombs, to the attack in the synagogue. What is your take on all of this?
Most presidents in a moment of crisis like this, especially with such a huge emotional element, most of us are hurting. They heal, they unite, they inspire. It's not exactly rocket science. You look all the way through American history. That's what presidents do. It's not in Donald Trump's software to do this. He's a one-trick pony. His single political MO is to try to divide and conquer, to pit groups against one another and benefit from it politically, even after a tragedy like what happened on Saturday. What other president in our history, Stephanie, would have made those jokes he did about his hair, would have gone on with this political rally just a few hours after this happened? It gets to empathy. One of the things that we ask from a president is to have a little bit of empathy.
To my fellow doctors and to fellow scientists and to just concerned people that there was something seriously the matter.
I'm concerned about many things about his mental instability, but especially in the immediate present, I'm most worried about his unfettered authority to launch nuclear weapons.
We also can understand psychopathology, this idea of a feeling that one has the right to do whatever they desire to do. We also see the idea of, talk about obsession and compulsive behavior being played out.
There are people who lie all the time and don't know it. Confabulation is when someone tells you something that's absolutely wrong and they firmly believe it to be true. This happens a lot with people with neurologic disease. When you see someone who lies all the time, you say, what could be wrong with that person? Is this a personality problem? Or is this a brain problem? Is it getting worse?
We feel generally that there should be a more extensive kind of examination of American presidents or potential American presidents, and especially in relationship to their potential response to an extreme crisis, such as nuclear threat.
Trump has his finger on the triggers of 3,000 or 4,000 nuclear weapons. It's clear that if he even took one step in that direction, he could turn the world wars and the genocides of the 20th century into minor footnotes in the history of human violence. We can see a level of violent destructiveness on this earth that we've never seen before.
This is not a political conference. It is a medical one. It is about the state of mental health in our country and the survival of our human species. Hence, leading national security experts and renowned mental health experts have exceptionally convened here today to speak about the safeguarding of American democracy and all humankind.
You want to ask yourself, we have an unstable, unlawful, unjust candidate here, neck and neck with the opponent in the polls, and would he be fit to run any company? Would any company hire him to run a company? Would any union hire him to run a union? Would any university hire him to run a university? Would any small business hire him to run? And yet he's right with his opponent for president. So remember all those things. I think people are not getting communicated. He's entertaining people with these instabilities and his braggadocio. He says he doesn't like endless wars, but he's just threatened to blow Iran to smithereens. He likes instant demolitions rather than endless wars. So that's quite a serious combination. I don't think the media has ever got its arms around Donald J. Trump other than to promote his outrageous statements.
I'm a lawyer, and I'm telling you, there's not much we can do for you now. I've been practicing law and teaching law, mostly teaching law for 30 years, practicing law before that, and my 2.5 years in the Bush White House as the chief White House ethics lawyer. The Constitution never contemplated this much power for the President of the United States. I teach a seminar on presidential power, and we're discussing that just this semester. But we've had a steady growth of presidential power domestically since Abraham Lincoln. He had to suspend habeas corpus in order to fight the Civil War, but without the consent of Congress. And internationally, since Teddy Roosevelt. We have seen more and more presidential power with fewer and fewer checks coming from Congress and from the courts. We have to take extraordinary care to make absolutely sure that the person who holds the highest office in the land is mentally fit, morally fit for office. And you've heard a lot from me as a lawyer, whether I comment on TV or I write op-eds, and you've heard more from other lawyers you'll hear today. But I want to emphasize how important it is to hear from mental health professionals, such as Dr. Bandy Lee, who have the right, the constitutional right to speak their minds. And it's critically important that mental health experts speak out. The Goldwater Rule restricting their freedom of speech. Private associations seeking to restrict the freedom of speech of their members are doing grave harm to our democracy.
The last time that the Congress actually declared war was, you guessed it, World War II. Though since World War II, we have fought about 17 actual wars. And that is because Congress is basically willing to turn over the war function to the president without question. And the only thing that Congress does is appropriate funds for the conflicts that presidents initiate in one way or another after the conflict has been initiated, rarely withholding funds. So even the appropriations power Congress is rarely willing to exercise in constraint of presidents. Therefore, when the president is acting in his or her commander-in-chief role, she is most apt to have near dictatorial powers. And this is one critical reason that the moral character of the president is of profound importance. Unless we are prepared to wholly rewrite the constraints that operate on presidents with regard to their commander-in-chief and foreign affairs powers, we must be prepared to closely monitor the moral fitness of anyone who ascends to that high and largely unbounded role. Impeachment, I think, is now fairly a dead letter. Prosecution is gone for official acts, and I can tell you that any order coming down through the chain of command from the president will be considered an official act. We're left with moral character. Therefore, in this election, the most important thing is the moral character of the individual that we elect for president.
Ronald Reagan did call me to the White House, and he said, "Why did you vote against me?" Well, it just so happened that I had done my homework, and I knew more about the budget probably than most, and I explained it to him. To me, his reaction was exceedingly positive. I respected him because he listened to me, he asked me questions, and he respected me because I did my homework and I was willing to speak truth to power. These are characters that we need in a president in order to have a functional democracy, because members of Congress need to feel like they are being heard. Sadly, in Mr. Trump, we know that he is not interested in talking to anybody unless they agree with him. And he's more interested in telling them what to do rather than asking them what to do. This is one of the most critical elections in the history of the United States, and it is essential to have a House and a Senate that has a mind of their own and do not march lockstep with anyone that sits in the White House. That we only have 29 former Republican members of Congress, but there are countless other Republican former members of Congress who are also going to vote that way, but they are remaining silent for fear of losing business, for fear of their lives, for fear about their children. And this violence is exacerbated by the man who is running for the presidency.
Donald Trump is just such a little man and should never again be in control of America's nuclear arsenal. We're lucky to have survived his first presidency and can't risk that our luck will endure through his second one. If there is any position that requires rational judgment, sober circumspection, wisdom, knowledge, restraint, understanding of adversaries, careful deliberation, and empathy, it's the presidency of the United States, a position that makes its occupant one of the two people in the world who have veto power over the future existence of life on this planet. Donald Trump may be the most egregiously unfit person to have that responsibility, but that's a power that no one should have. It is madness that almost 80 years after the atomic destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we still have more than 12,000 nuclear bombs in the world. It is madness that today the world is again on the brink of nuclear war. It is madness that no one stands between the President of the United States and authorization to launch America's nuclear arsenal. It is madness that, according to an August 20th New York Times article by David Sanger, U.S. policy now envisions fighting and winning a simultaneous three-front nuclear war against Russia, China, and North Korea. It is madness that, according to the August 20th Bulletin of Atomic Scientists and other reliable sources, there are nuclear strategists who believe the U.S. can launch a preemptive nuclear attack against our adversaries to which they would be unable to respond. And it would be absolute madness to ever let Donald Trump regain access to those nuclear codes.
Climate change is happening faster than expected, faster than the scientists thought. I think that should be obvious to anybody who has been experiencing the extreme weather of the last few years. The second is we know the solution to climate change. This is really important. There's been a lot of obfuscation on this. We know the solution is to build as much carbon-free power as possible, primarily renewable energy, as much storage as possible, and then electrify the economy, replace regular vehicles with electric vehicles, replace heating from natural gas boilers with electric heat pumps, and generally whatever process you can replace with electricity and run it on renewables. That is the solution, and that means that the next president we pick is going to be one of the most consequential decisions any of us have to make, because right now we are on the kind of razor's edge of whether we're going to be able to avoid catastrophic climate change or not. We have a responsibility to our children to leave them a world where they have a shot at having a climate that is livable. And it would be the greatest, immoral crime if we, the adults, acted like teenagers and ransacked the house and expect our kids to be the one to clean it up. And I personally can't think of anything more immoral than that. So I think it's incumbent on every single one of us, whether we have money, whether we have a position, whether we're a journalist, to speak out and get the word out that this is a serious problem. We know the solution, and this election is going to decide whether or not we make a vote on behalf of our children, or whether we say we don't care about our children at all. We do not care what world we live them. We're just going to float through the world, and if we have some bizarre notion that one particular policy of Donald Trump is somehow going to benefit us narrowly, it's still going to destroy the world for our future children and grandchildren.
In addressing national security challenges, a president must place the interests of the country before their own. He must base the decisions on facts, not emotion, and should not be swayed by how the decision will be viewed by others. A president must be driven by a call to do what is right for the country and not what is right for themselves. Ultimately, the president makes the final decision on most national security challenges. A president must have the integrity and the self-confidence needed to take responsibility for poor decisions and not blame others. This includes acknowledging to the American people responsibility for making the wrong decision. Who we elect in November will have profound effect on our lives and especially on our U.S. national interests. We need a president with the fitness, the moral character to do what is always right, and that requires judgment, temperament, and integrity. 3 personal traits that Donald Trump does not possess.
I'm a retired Army general, medical corps officer, and a psychiatrist. I think I'm a bridge between this panel, the kinds of remarks that we heard from Admiral Smith and Professor Kuznick, everyone here, and the next panel on mental health. Because I want to speak specifically to the issues of fitness for duty and for dangerousness as we evaluate people in our respective roles. That is, our work as military physicians, we were called on frequently. It was fundamental to our practice that we would do evaluations for fitness for duty. We had to respond to a request of our leaders to say, should this person be cleared here, have a security clearance? Can this person be put back into the cockpit? Should this surgeon go into the OR? We have what we call the nuclear surety program. Should this person have access to nuclear weapons? Now, that was the call of the leader. That was the decision of the commander to make, to decide who was going to be assigned where, what their responsibilities were, and what authority they were going to have. Our position, my position as a physician, was to evaluate, to advise that leader about what I knew about that person's health and their mental health, and to see if there was if there was a problem in the way that that person was currently experiencing that may interfere with executing those duties. My job, many, many times as an Army doctor, was to say what nobody else wanted to hear. Sir, this person can't do his job. This is going to be dangerous. See something, say something. And that's what I think is what we're obligated to do.
I became chief of the Soviet Foreign Policy Branch in CIA during the 70s. Later, I worked under 7 presidents, briefing with the President's Daily Brief, 3 of them, one of them one-on-one during the first 4 years of Ronald Reagan's term. I have been educated by people like Professor Peter Kuznick, and I thank him for his words about madness. I'll be discussing the opposite of that, which is sanity. Fitness for office is critically important. The most essential feature of fitness is sanity. In the nuclear age, sanity rests on appreciating an absolutely fundamental truth. And that truth is that there is no security without mutual security. Any president or anyone running for president who doesn't understand this is not sane, no matter how smart he or she is. In the nuclear age today, the golden rule has become not just a moral imperative, but a practical necessity.
Legal methods have failed, political approaches have failed, and military means have not been able to prevent the many dangers that we have encountered. And so I would like to ask each of the panelists what message they would like to give to the public, because that seems to be our last recourse.
The decision is yours. The Supreme Court's not going to help you. Congress isn't going to help you. You need to help yourself. You are entitled to choose the next president of the United States and focus principally on character, moral character, and fitness. Time is of the essence, and we live in a time of great risk if there is someone in the White House who's mentally incompetent for the job.
I did not speak about Donald Trump in my remarks, but had I had more time, I would have gone through the many, many instances during the Trump administration in which President Trump was pulled back from the brink in misusing the military, in misusing and abusing the chain of command for personal purposes. I'll mention just one because we're coming up on the vote, which is that President Trump, it's been now well established, had a plan to use the US Army to seize voting machines to try to rerun the election. Any president who believes that it is within his competence as president to order such a thing and to use the US military to do that is neither sane nor morally fit to be the President of the United States.
Thanks. My most important message to the American people is to understand that these speakers here and the ones that will be following are going to make it very clear that Mr. Trump is completely unfit. But as I had said earlier, it's absolutely critical that you pay attention to the folks that you are electing to the House and the Senate. You are the people responsible for some of the crazies that we have there. So the reality is that the power is in your hands, and it is time for leadership, and it is time to sit at the table, look across the table, eyeball to your family members and to your friends, and to speak the truth to them at what you're hearing here today about the risks that are involved and the threat to our democracy. And it is also important to look at Project 2025, because this is not one man alone who is running for the presidency. It is a cabal of individuals who only have their own self-interest at heart. They do not care about the American people. And that has been evidenced by what is already taking place. The dictatorship has begun. When you tell a woman what she can and cannot do with her body, that is a dictatorship. When you tell schools what books they can and cannot have available to read in their libraries, that is a dictatorship. When you make it very clear that you have no interest in maintaining the laws that already exist for same-sex marriage, that is a dictatorship. So there is much that can be dismantled beyond national security that will affect each and every one of us throughout the United States and throughout the world, because the President of the United States is perceived as the guardian of the free world. And so it's incumbent upon us to take on that responsibility to be actively engaged in this next election, not just for the one person at the top of the ticket, but for all the way down ticket.
There are so many reasons to be frightened by the thought of a Donald Trump presidency, but I'm going to cite two of my favorite movies. The first was a 1959 nuclear war movie called On the Beach. And while the people in Melbourne, the last pocket of surviving humanity, are waiting to die from the effects of the nuclear war, there was a rally with a banner there, and it said, "There is still time, brother." And then they show it again at the very end, and there's nobody left alive. But for us, there's still time. We can make sure that this doesn't happen. We can reverse the way things are going now. And the second one I want to mention is a 1991 Japanese movie that won all the Japanese Academy Awards that year called Black Rain. And in that one, it's about Hiroshima, and they show, they have an atomic bomb survivor, Hibakusha, who's dying, and he gets the news that the United States is threatening to use nuclear weapons again in Korea. And he comments, he says, "An unjust peace is better than a just war." And I think we have to think about that and contemplate it, especially in the nuclear age, when there is no room for war, and that's what we're confronting in the world today.
So I just would have two messages to the American voter. And first is, do you want to return to a period of vengeful impulsiveness and total chaos that is not only a threat to our national security abroad, but it's a threat to our personal freedoms at home? Or do you want to vote for an individual who does have the judgment, does have the temperament, and does have the integrity to be a fully qualified and completely capable commander-in-chief on day one? Those are the choices, and the future of our country truly is at stake.
So a couple minutes here. I think these are all the right messages. I don't think it's about the message. I think it's how you say it and how you and the audience, the people that need to know and understand. And my efforts and my focus have been on those veterans that are undecided for either Harris or Trump in the battleground states. I think those veterans can have a huge influence on certainly their family network around them. And someone needs to speak to them. We need to speak to them in a straightforward, clear way that they grasp what this means in order, as Congressman Schneider was saying, you need a leader who's fit. Are you going to follow somebody that you can't trust? You're going to risk, I mean, we tell that to soldiers all the time. Really? And should we expect a soldier who's in our squad to take on a mission who doesn't trust his particular squad leader or his platoon leader or his company commander? That's not going to happen. So I think our challenge here is, how do we get the wording? How do we connect to these young folks? How do we get them off the couch? How do we get them to understand this is what fitness is? This is who you trust. This is how you can make that decision, and you've got to do it.
Thank you.
The president is a raving lunatic. He is not well. Those are not my words. Those are the words of Andrew Gillum, the former Democratic mayor of Tallahassee, who came in second in last year's race for governor in Florida. He was echoing what has become mainstream thinking now about the mental health of the president of the United States during a week in which the president has said he is the king of the Jews, the second coming of God, the chosen one. It is the same week in which, even though he sees himself as a king, a god, a chosen one, Denmark somehow found the strength to defy him and refuse to sell Greenland to the United States. Dr. Doda's contributed articles to the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, 27 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. A new edition of that book was published this year with 10 more entries, which then changed the subtitle to 37 Psychiatrists and Mental Health Experts Assess a President. In that book, Dr. Dodas writes, Mr. Trump's sociopathic characteristics are undeniable. They create a profound danger for America's democracy and safety. Over time, these characteristics will only become worse.
Because he has a fundamental need to be all-powerful and all-loved, can't stand challenges. And the nature of democracy is that it challenges people. We have more than one opinion. So the more it was predictable that once he got into a position where people would challenge him, there are two parties, he would become more unhinged. The more unhinged he becomes, the more paranoid and the more violent, potentially.
Dr. Bandy Lee warns Trump is going to get worse and it will become uncontainable.
The love in the air. I've never seen anything like it.
Peter, I was one of those people who bought the book by a bunch of psychiatrists in 2017 called The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, all about his apparent mental health issues. But from your book, we learned that John Kelly, Trump's own White House chief of staff, also bought the book to read and thought it was a helpful guide to a boss who he came to consider as a pathological liar. Donald J. Trump has been a very loud, some might say too loud, part of our political scene for over 7 years now. And yet, I would argue that we as a political culture, as a media industry, as an American public, as a country, we still end up normalizing him.
Welcome, everyone, to this special Mid-Atlantic Salon event. My name is David Troy, and I'm the host and curator of TEDx Mid-Atlantic. Steve is an expert on undue influence, brainwashing, and unethical hypnosis, and he's the author of best-selling books, Combating Cult Mind Control and The Cult of Trump. And for over 40 years, he's helped thousands of individuals and families recover from undue influence or mind control. He is sought after as one of the foremost authorities on undue influence, brainwashing, deprogramming, and controlling groups and individuals.
But what I've learned is that when you're in a mind control cult, you don't feel it, you don't think you are, but you'll say that other group was, and I will often show videos of the Heaven's Gate people before they died. Oh, you may think I'm in a cult, but this is the wisest thing I've ever done. I'm going up to the spaceship. Literally, they talked like that. And I've yet to show that video to anyone and not have them say, oh man, those people were in a cult. Those people were brainwashed, right? So the idea is to not attack the leader, the doctrine, or the policy straight on, but find examples.
Donald Trump is likely guilty of mass murder. He's guilty of willful or at least grossly negligent manslaughter of hundreds of thousands of Americans. And this is not ordinarily talked about.
So this is, are you talking about the response to COVID and his delayed response to that and not taking it seriously and telling people to drink bleach or shine a light inside the body?
Had we intervened in time, the vast majority of deaths from COVID in the United States would not have happened.
You've described, I guess implicitly, Donald Trump as a threat to America's soul.
The trajectory we are in is very perilous. Since the spread of the Trump contagion, I've also described the course we are on as a death spiral.
The reason why so many of you have potentially heard of her, why she's such an important guest to have tonight, is that she led a group of mental health professional colleagues in diagnosing and writing about, breaking the silence about Donald Trump, our previous president.
In 2017, when I first held a major conference at Yale and published The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, people might have recoiled at our use of the word dangerous. Now, 7 years later, many are feeling the existential dangers to our democracy, to our civilization, and to everything we have cherished, including our sense of decency, humanity, goodness, and truth.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Don Lemon Show. I have the pleasure of being joined today by Dr. Bandy Lee. Dr. Bandy Lee is a forensic psychologist and academic whose work is focused primarily on violence and a book on the psychology of the former president himself, President Donald Trump. Dr. Lee, thank you so much for coming on. The name of your book is The Psychology of Trump Contagion. The subtitle, I think, really explains what it is. The subtitle is what?
An existential threat to American democracy and all humankind. The reason why we came out saying that he was a public health threat, not just someone with an individual dangerous psychology, but that because of the powerful and influential position to which he was elected, he would spread his symptoms over time to the point where his individual psychological dangers have become social, cultural, geopolitical, and civic dangers.
Dr. Lee, welcome back to the program. You've been writing and talking about Donald Trump and his threats and his psychology for a long, long time, and you know how the APA went after you, and I want to get into that. But most recently, Donald Trump is now talking about bloodbaths and Jews, kind of in the not quite in the same sentence, but in ways that are bringing back some really scary echoes. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me back. So we've been warning against the psychological dangers of Donald Trump ever since he won the first presidency, and what we had been warning against, that his psychological dangers would translate into social, cultural, civic, and geopolitical dangers over time if he were not properly contained, has now come to pass. And that is why it was so critical that we come in early and alert the public. That's why we mobilized as mental health professionals. In 2017, soon after inauguration, we got together as a group to do the conference at Yale School of Medicine that I organized, that we pulled together to publish The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump within that year. And after that, hundreds of, and later thousands of psychiatrists and other mental health experts joined us. That's how we formed the World Mental Health Coalition. I myself was never political before. I wasn't using psychiatry to support a political position. I was coming out as a health professional concerned about public safety and humanity's survival. These are overarching concerns that we are actually legally and ethically obligated to act upon. Psychiatrists, psychologists, and other mental health professionals were among the first to recognize the dangers of a Trump presidency. This is why in 2017, we came together to hold a conference at the Yale School of Medicine to discuss our duty to warn as a part of our professional societal responsibility. This year, with this conference, we are releasing the more dangerous case of Donald Trump. 40 psychiatrists and mental health experts warn anew.
In helping to initiate this process, I emphasized what I called the malignant normality to which we were exposed by Trump and Trumpists, and that's what contributed to his dangerousness. That malignant normality sought to make routine and ever present the serial falsehoods that Trump has exposed us to. The factual truth that I am a research psychiatrist participating in a panel on the dangerousness of Donald Trump and contributing to a book on that subject. Now, that's different from a religious or ideological truth or opinion of any kind. And it has a certain appeal because it's definitive and it can't be altered. It's there. And that's in contrast with the lies and falsehoods which are maintained endlessly. One always needs a new lie in order to cover over the first lie. So it's a continuous serial lying, and that has become recognized more and more. We can recognize now the importance of factual truth, and in that recognition, we can bring new energy in our work and confidence in the importance of our efforts. Thank you.
Whatever psychological or cognitive disorders a person has, power makes them worse. Power amplifies them. So that we predicted, for example, in our 2017 book, that given a position of power, Donald Trump's grandiosity could morph into delusions of grandeur, that his paranoid tendencies could become full-fledged paranoid delusions, that his impulsivity and his failures of judgment would get worse when there were no limits set and no consequences for his erratic behavior. And all of that has unfortunately come true. It is established in law that high-ranking military officers who have access, for example, to the nuclear codes, are required to have a full physical and mental health evaluation for fitness for duty, conducted by independent experts, not physicians. We should be required. We should be requiring the same of anyone who proposes to be commander-in-chief.
I want to focus on his dangerousness. Now, what does that mean? The most dangerous mass murderers in history, Hitler, Stalin, Mao, and so forth, Mussolini, probably never killed anybody themselves at all, or if they did, as a few individuals. But they've gone down in history as the greatest or worst mass murderers in history because they incited their followers, millions of followers, to commit millions of murders for them. And in principle, that I think raises the question I would have about Trump. I'd say that his dangerousness isn't what he himself can do as an individual. It's his capacity and his ability to engage millions of followers to agree with him and to support him in whatever he wants to do. I'm reminded of what French psychiatrists observed in the 19th century, and which I've seen in my own clinical practice. And that's the phenomenon they call folie à deux, where a dominant, influential family member develops, say, a paranoid delusion of persecution. You know, the police are spying on us, or there's an influencing machine that's controlling our thoughts, or some, crazy delusion. And then a dependent, influenceable family member will make the assumption, gee, that must be correct, because this person is saying it. This is the dominant person in our family. And they just, they adopt the same delusion. But, and this is the really important thing, what they also discovered was when they separated the two, the person who was not independently psychotic dropped the psychotic belief and, just show that they were capable of reality testing in a perfectly. The greatest historical example of that, I'd say, occurred in Germany during the 1930s, when a dominant figure named Hitler came up with delusions of persecution, that the Jews were persecuting the Germans and they had to be exterminated in order for the Germans to protect themselves. And millions of people with no history of criminality, these weren't psychopaths, but millions of just normal German people said, well, this must be true, because he says it's true, and we believe it and we'll act accordingly. And you know what resulted. But then what's really significant is once Hitler was out of the picture, after he'd lost the war and committed suicide, the Germans recovered their sanity.
Trump, when he speaks, is an entertainer. He's not a politician. He's not a philosopher. He's just a entertainer, and that's where he came from. But it's not entertaining to think of what he can do. The other part of my own personal history is that I have witnessed a nuclear explosion. In July of 1962, I was on the flight deck of my aircraft carrier in the Pacific, where I was a weapons officer, and I witnessed an ICBM shot 100 miles straight up with a nuclear bomb exploding above the atmosphere of the world. So there was no sound. It lit up the entire Pacific for an hour or so. We blocked out radio communications from Japan to Hawaii, and that was the last above-ground nuclear explosion the United States did. So I am generally afraid of what could happen if this man has the nuclear button. He boasted that he has a bigger button than Kim Jong-un. And what we don't talk about is all the other countries that have nuclear weapons, including Israel, including Pakistan, including India, and probably South Africa, and France, and England, all have nuclear weapons. So even when one blows up, we're not going to know where it came from. So we have to have someone who is sane, someone who is reliable, and all the other factors that were mentioned already this morning by the panel. And we have to make sure that this word gets out, that this man is not to be depended upon. Now, it has been said that we aren't able to diagnose people at a distance. I have to disagree with that, because frequently, as forensic psychiatrists, we're called upon to diagnose people from the death certificates, the medical records, with interviews in jail and places where we don't have all of the lengthy examinations that psychiatrists generally do. You can still make a diagnosis. And that's been done many times with Donald Trump. And it's very clear, as has been pointed out, that his mental faculties are deteriorating. If you try to read any of his speeches given at his rallies, he does not make sense. And it's clear that this is worse than it used to be. It was bad enough in the beginning, but there are signs of cognitive impairment now. And the mass media made much more of Biden's cognitive impairment, which is relatively mild and somehow based upon his history of stuttering when you listen to him. They don't make that much out of Trump's cognitive impairment. You wonder why.
We health professionals, including mental health professionals, operate from a certain set of ethical principles, and in society are granted certain privileges and certain status because we commit to doing our best to follow those ethical principles. Most importantly for the health professions are those of beneficence, doing good, and non-maleficence, do no harm, to put it simply. I also come out of a long history of grassroots organizing and activism. Most recently, in the last 15 years or so, a struggle to get psychologists out of the Bush administration torture in CIA, Guantanamo, et cetera. Many of the panelists here today on both panels were part of that effort in various ways. I think the danger of Donald Trump that I want to focus on is that he is a dark side personified without any of the other forces that in each of us helps to contain that antisocial part of us and keep us from becoming monsters. And the danger I want to call attention to in the brief time that we have is the danger that he frees that up in many in our society and contributes to a brutalization of society. Following this is not a unique thing. When we dealt with torture, it was kind of an odd experience because we were dealing with a relatively small amount, a few hundred to a few thousand people who were tortured as part of the Bush administration war on terror and Iraq war, and whereas millions suffer in our very brutal penal system. But it sets a norm. And we were so concerned because having legalized torture and abuse reduced the norms that control the dark side in us. So I think Donald Trump is building on that kind of experience and furthering the brutalization of society.
How many people think this very disordered man and his bombastic nature makes him strong? Well, I don't know. I guess we're going to see. But I have made some remarks because I got involved in this in 2016, and I remember the American Psychiatric Association saying, unless you'd seen somebody in person, you really couldn't comment on their mental health. And I thought, I haven't seen him in person, but I've seen more about him with more exposure than I possibly could have seen if I had an hour or two in person with him. He had revealed so much about who he was and what his deficits were. And so I entitled my chapter that I wrote for the first book, Seeing What You See, Saying What You See, because it seemed to me that we really were seeing in front of us a man who was unable to see beyond himself. People don't like to think about Hitler, and they certainly don't like to think about Trump as analogous or identical, but I actually see it that way. And I think it's very important to be aware that this is a dangerous person and that, does he really believe what he says? I think he really does believe what he says. And I think he believes it with vengeance. He equates immigrants to the Jews. We're so far away from the Holocaust that it's hard for us to believe that he will produce a Trump Holocaust, and it will be immigrants, and it's very difficult for people to understand that he means what he says. And when he started to talk about how in the first 3 months of his administration, he was going to round up millions of immigrants and deport them. And then I thought, what happens when, he's so fixated on money, even more than most of us, and he starts saying that he's going to get rid of them, he's going to deport them. What happens when he recognizes it's cheaper to annihilate them? Why is there not going to be a Trump final solution?
On February 27, 2020, President's Day, the World Mental Health Coalition, led by Bandy Lee, held a meeting in New York City. They noted how the failure to conceive the Trump problem as one of mental health had resulted in the political failure to impeach, and how our understanding of oppression and warfare was failing to account for the psychological weaponry being employed. So they put forward a tool for citizens groups to correctly identify and target the problem, the first declaration of freedom of mind in history. The world will remember that day. The declaration opens up unprecedented ways to protect the mind, including by submitting the declaration to the United Nations. More than a tool, we now have a template and a blueprint that can act as the basis for an international agreement guaranteeing the most fundamental of all freedoms. The declaration responds to the authoritarian takeover and public health emergency that marked the Trump presidency and breaks new ground with its protections. It specifies and outlaws all the main variants of mind control. It defines and prohibits the phenomenon of mental slavery, as well as specifying a psychological right to individuate. And, with respect to today's theme of presidential fitness and the duty to warn, the Declaration creates an unqualified prohibition of censoring speech, media, and experts in relation to mental health issues, together with an unqualified right of the public to fully access information and expertise. By definition, an unqualified prohibition or right permits no exemptions. Current human rights law, by contrast, permits restricting freedom of speech in times of emergency, despite it being emergencies which most strongly call for the public intervention of experts. The hallmark of authoritarianism is an imbalanced and abuse of power within a human relationship, the blind submission to authority and the suppression of one's free will. Authoritarianism begins at home and endures in our schools, workplaces, and institutions. Before it becomes a political or social problem, it is first a psychological disorder afflicting individuals. This disorder afflicts both ruled and ruler, victim and victimizer, or predator and prey, to quote Trump himself. This is the dividing line, not traditional left or right, but authoritarian or democratic, anti or pro-social, pathologically disordered or not. Protecting freedom of mind is as much education as it is law. The public need to learn to defend this freedom against those who would violate it. By learning to form and articulate their own opinions and challenge those of others, people can overcome their submissive attitudes. Ira Shaleph's models of courageous fellowship and intelligent disobedience are the building block to this democratic revolution.
This is a public health emergency. We need to preventively educate everyone about how to tell the difference between ethical influence and unethical influence. This is called the influence continuum. It's part of my doctoral dissertation. It's on my website, freedomofmind.com. And people need to have psychoeducation. We need preventive education. We need to train people how to do interventions with people who've been brainwashed. People are asking, what do we do after? No matter what happens, whether Trump gets elected, we need a massive psychoeducational effort. And we need recovery. We need to make it okay to say, I was in that cult. And I've been trying to model that. I was in the Moonies. I thought this fat Korean billionaire was the Messiah. I turned my back on my religion, which is Judaism. I turned my back on my country. Educated about the Holocaust, I was like a Nazi. We do need to think about what happens after the election because we have to depolarize our country. And the only way to do it is for people who have loved ones who've been radicalized into MAGA to understand these folks have been brainwashed, but there's a way out, and people are waking up and leaving and talking out. There's a group called Leaving MAGA. I interviewed Rich Logis, who founded that. We need to create an off-ramp to destigmatize. We need to stop calling people morons and idiots who are in a cult and speak to them, build common ground, and ask them good questions that make them think. The critical thing is that if you attack the leader, the doctrine, or the policy head on and try to argue facts, it activates the cult identity to get defensive. They feel persecuted. It's an ill-advised strategy. What works, and what worked in my deprogramming, was being told about Chinese communist brainwashing. That I was willing to listen to.
The founders feared that every so often in a democracy, there would be a Trump. They knew it would happen at some point. They didn't know at what point. And many of us are still trying to figure out what's the combination of psychological, social, cultural, historical factors that have created the opportunity for a Donald Trump. But they knew there would be one. And the reason they knew there would be one was because a flaw in democratic theory that was known by the social contract philosophers was that humans is a flaw in human nature, that humans are vulnerable to demagogues, and that demagogues can draw out what the social contract philosophers described as the passions of the mob. I think we're all in agreement that the White House is not the appropriate institution to house Donald Trump. Certainly not for the next several months or for the next several years. There's a really important point made earlier by Brigadier General Sanakis about how, and Judy Herman made a similar comment. It's not just a diagnosis that matters. It's to what extent do we know things about this person that make them troubling in particular ways. And in Donald Trump's case, they're troubling in virtually every way, and they can be quantified. The founders didn't just expect a Trump. They tried to limit the likelihood and to mitigate the damage that could be done by somebody like Donald Trump. They didn't expect anyone would ever have his lack of honor, I don't think, nor the lack of honor of the Republicans who have supported him and been complicit, and who could have gotten rid of him after January 6th and chose not to out of their own cowardice and avarice and quest for power. And on top of it, the Supreme Court taught us with its immunity decision before it made it that it would use delay as a way of deciding cases. Because remember how it waited so long to do that? Well, you know, all it takes is a handful of courts that delay and a handful of cases that get up to the Supreme Court where they delay to pass the deadline and it goes to the House of Representatives. To speak to the voters of America, these are the times that try your souls, and you have to preserve our democracy.
The public has been starved of mental health knowledge because of the American Psychiatric Association expanding the Goldwater rule.
What is the role of I feel we're in an emergency right now. It's a 5-star alarm and not being treated as such. But the press in helping us and help saving us, because, you know, they had a lot of power in pushing Biden now in the New York Times, the editorials and this and that, but I don't see that effort. And if you have any ideas how to appeal to the press other than letters to the editor or people at your level can somehow, because they will reach the voters. So, thank you.
You're welcome. Would anyone like to answer?
I would like to say that Bandy's been censored.
I know.
I have been censored. I used to be in the media all the time. Every cult story, I would be on every major thing. Nope. There are corporate media empires, and at some level, are they Opus Dei? Are they Putin influence? I don't know, but there's censorship at a very high level. All I can say is I've been doing a lot of podcasts and smaller events like this because we have to get the word out to the public.
And also that censorship has to be understood as a human rights violation. It's not currently.
He really tunes in to people's humiliation, and especially a segment of the population of white males, and also gender is a very big deal, and appeal to males and strength and the things that you've mentioned, but also people who are poorly educated.
A sense of humiliation is a kind of a common thread in the populations that demagogues appeal to. People who feel they are losing out to others, or that their social group is being devalued or is losing undeserved privileges. And that, I think, is the common appeal of authoritarian leaders. They can't really offer people freedom or prosperity, so they offer people the idea of restoring a glorious past in which they will be on top. I would just like to second the advice of my colleagues who have advocated reaching out to Trump followers with an attitude of respect rather than calling them a basket of deplorables. The more they feel disrespected and humiliated, the more the humiliated rage finds its expression in the cult of Trump.
Yeah, I agree very much with what you just said, and Dr. Harmon, and the emphasis on humiliation. What I was struck by is how much Trump appeals to that sense of humiliation in his political rhetoric. He, for example, when he first started campaigning, he said the Democrats had made America the laughing stock of the world, in which he was basically echoing the rhetoric of Hitler that led the German people to vote for him when he was elected on the campaign promise to undo the shame of Versailles. He said the whole German nation had been humiliated and shamed by the war guilt clause of the peace treaty of Versailles. But Trump has said that repeatedly over and over again. And I think that the people who, well, and he has presented himself as the one who would restore pride and undo the shame and humiliation that he's saying the American people have suffered. And I think it's understandable in some ways who the Trump voters are. They're basically white, male, less educated, high school or less education. But in others, there are people who feel they have lost relative status because of the increased democratization that occurred in America when, with the civil rights legislation, blacks increased their status. Segregation was outlawed and disenfranchisement was outlawed and so forth. And the increased status that women have had with the women's movement. I think that a lot of white males have felt they had lost relative superiority and relative status. And Trump comes along and says, I will restore, I'll make America great again, which is an appeal to go back to the past. We have to find a way to be, I think, understanding and generous and treat people with respect, even when we think they're making great mistakes and really harming themselves as well as other people.
What gives me hope is that the women may save us. I think that the appeal of women, the whole anti-abortion and all of that business, and the freedom and human rights, I think the women are going to come save us. That's my hope.
Well, when someone has made a big mess, that's what we're for, right? We cleaned up other people's messes.
Dr. Friedman?
It's not just the women who will save us, it's the part of men that are very much like women in that they have a capacity for kindness and for caring about others. I think we need to remember that Richard Hofstadter wrote a book in the 60s called The Paranoid Style in American Politics. We have always had problem with paranoid feelings and the sense that when you tell people they're in danger, it tends to mobilize in some people more their paranoid core. And the more we're aware of the fact that danger can be constructed, and we can attack all of Trump's personality disorders, but the fact is that he appeals to people, and we have to understand it not in a kind way, but in a technical way, that there is more paranoia in the population than is acknowledged, and he can mobilize it, and we don't know how far it will continue to hold against a black woman who presents herself as entirely reasonable, speaking to their needs, and will it overcome people's fear that they are going to be displaced by people of color, that they are going to lose their prestige and their dominance. So I think we have to not be so respectful of people who follow Trump, but we have to understand that they're in the throes of paranoid mechanisms.
Thank you. We're out of time, but this is not the end. Please join us in the reception until 5 p.m. There will be hors d'oeuvres. You can approach any of the panelists to ask your questions. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Morality, greed is good. I mean, Ayn Rand.
Yes, political brand. You can read.
I'll remember that.
Yeah, South Koreans told me when they speak, it sounds very like robotic.
Read whatever you want to read.
You even have the amendments.
Without fear or harassment.